Dear fellow addicts, welcome back. And today I'll be talking about arguably the most impactful trend in the hookah industry nowadays, namely Russian Shisha. And unless you still smoke like this, you probably have heard the term Russian Shisha before. But just in case you haven't, here's a brief overview. Russian Shisha refers to a specific trend in the hookah industry. It is associated with premium quality, complex flavors, higher strength, and overall drive for innovation. The best place to experience that would be a Russian-style hookah lounge, which usually includes a fusion kitchen and bar, Chinese tea, and a large assortment of Russian tobacco brands. These lounges usually work with hookahs, bowls, and other accessories imported from Russia, and they emphasize mixology and complex, unique flavors. Now back to the topic. Before I explain in detail what Russian Shisha is and how it transformed the industry, let's just talk briefly about the history of hookah in general. It is not clear where and when hookah originated, but historians generally agree it was either India or Persia. One of the accounts states that it was invented in the second half of the 16th century by a Persian physician who worked for a Mughal emperor, Akbar the Great. The purpose of the invention was to filter the smoke from tobacco that was being introduced at that time in the Mughal Empire by the Europeans. Another account suggests that before the invention of hookah in India, it was known in Persia as early as the first half of the 16th century. For example, it was referenced in the writings of Ali Shirazi, Persian poet who lived until 1535. That would suggest that hookah could be known even before tobacco was introduced by the Europeans as a result of the Columbian exchange in Asia. The first hookahs had coconut shells and used bamboo sticks instead of the stem. And it was very likely that before hookah tobacco, they were used for smoking hashish and opium. As the history kind of progressed, hookah quickly became an attribute of nobility and royalty. Consequently, the design was also improved, and Persians fairly quickly moved towards glass bases and leather hoses. The bowls back then were also different. The so-called old-school funnels were used, and the charcoal was usually placed directly on top of the tobacco or tombak. This was obviously really harsh to smoke, but back then people didn't really care for large clouds, complex nuanced flavors, and they smoked it in kind of short draws, more like people smoke cigarettes today. It is important to note, though, that the popularity of hookah back then wasn't limited to the Middle East and India. European nobility has been historically interested in Eastern cultures, and as this painting suggests, hookah was a fashionable element of high society in Europe in the 19th century. However, with the introduction of machine-made cigarettes in the beginning of the 20th century, hookah quickly lost its appeal. No one wanted really to go through the hassle of hookah setup when you could simply just grab a cigarette, light it up in seconds, and have the nicotine that you wanted. Hookah did remain relevant, though, in less economically developed regions, for example, in Egypt, but it served more as a cheaper alternative to cigarettes. For example, back in the days, it probably was easier in Egypt to get a pack of Nakhla Zagul than to get the pack of imported cigarettes. And this pretty much could be the end of the story. Hookah would remain a cheaper alternative to cigarettes and will quickly fade into non-existence while kind of remaining a bit of a tradition, but eventually just dying off. But in 1988, one of the most pivotal moments in the hookah industry happened. Nakhla introduced the first ever flavored line of hookah tobacco. And the first three flavors that they dropped were strawberry, apricot, and apple. The infamous double apple was only introduced later in 1991. This thing gave a new meaning to hookah. This was the first time in modern history when hookah stopped being simply a delivery device for nicotine and became an end goal in itself. Less than 10 years later, in 1999, Al Fakir joined the game to later become one of the highest, if not the highest selling shisha brand of the 21st century. And while in the late 90s and early 2000s, Middle East certainly was the heart of the newly reborn hookah industry, America quickly started catching up with them. Two most notable brands from that time would be Fumari and Starbuzz. They started releasing tobacco in 2002 and 2005 respectively, and were known for bold flavors and unique mixes, bestsellers such as gummy bears or like Blue Mist, Fire Melon Dew, as opposed to mono flavors like apple or peach. It's important to know though that all the Alfacre, Fumari, Starbuzz, they were all using Virginia tobacco leaf as their base. It has a low nicotine concentration and a higher sugar concentration. And for a long time, this low nicotine, sweet and smooth flavor profile became sort of an industry standard. Not everyone, however, was satisfied with this standard. Eric Hoffman being one of those people. He quickly realized that Virginia isn't really optimal for shisha, and he started looking for less sugary options with higher nicotine content and more complex base flavor. Initially part of the Fumari team, Eric went on to launch his own brand called Tangiers in the early 2000s. He ended up using unwashed and boiled burley tobacco as base and pioneered many legendary flavors such as Cashmere Peach, Cane Mint, Eric's Mango, and others. Eric's venture was perhaps the second most important development in the modern hookah industry after Nakhle's flavored line of tobacco. Now, back to kind of the topic. In Russia, the renewed hookah culture with flavored tobacco started spreading around the same time as other countries. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, people started traveling and bringing home all the cool things. Hookah was obviously one of them. Now there was a catch. In other countries like the US, hookah was introduced as a tradition by the immigrants from the Middle East, while kind of slowly acquiring local fan base. In late 90s and early 2000s, you would most likely find hookah either in Middle Eastern cafes in the United States or maybe in some clubs. In Russia, on the other hand, hookah was from the start introduced as a luxury service for the locals. Since most Russian fine dining restaurants were 100% smoking area, hookah was a very natural luxury upgrade. Since its introduction to the Russian market, hookah was meant to impress and to emphasize the quality of the establishment. Another interesting detail about Russian hookah industry at that time, most of these restaurants outsourced their hookahs, so the hookah catering companies had to compete with each other for the spots at the best and most profitable restaurants. This provided a powerful drive for innovation and constant improvement. Initially, this competition was limited to gimmicks such as designer hookahs, cocktails in the base, and fruit heads. This served both as a way for a specific outsourcing company to stand out and also as a way to improve margins per hookah sold. Fancy glass hookahs were imported and some more affordable versions were being developed locally. Glass hookahs were especially popular at the time as they allowed for pretty cocktails in the base. However, in 2013, a new law was passed and smoking was prohibited in restaurants. This could have been the end of Russian shisha before it even took off. But this law inadvertently actually helped to develop the hookah industry. After smoking was banned in restaurants, hookah enthusiasts started opening hookah lounges. There, hookah was the main product, and the target customer base changed from restaurant goers desiring flashy, bougie-looking setups to real smoking experts who were there for the quality. At that time, Hookah Place, led by Anthony Gajvoronsky, aka John Galliano, opened its first locations to become later one of the most famous hookah lounge franchises in the entire world. Notably, around that time, Tangiers started gaining a lot of respect among Russian hookah smokers. It became obvious that if anyone in Russia was to attempt building a domestic shisha brand, Tangiers would be the benchmark to shoot for. And the attempts did follow. Although the first few were not successful, it became clear that hookah is a lucrative industry and there is money to be made there. Finally, in December 2014, after a long period of trial and error, including test sessions with the Hookah Place team, Dark Side released its first line. They became the first company in Russia to do it at the quality and the scale level of Tangiers. Soon thereafter must have followed the suit. Alongside the developments in tobacco, Russian hookahs, bowls, and later on heat management and other accessories also started developing. Furthermore, in 2016, WTO released the world's first cigar leaf-based shisha. Thus, by 2016, the Russian hookah industry truly took off, and after a short period, all foreign brands got pushed out of the market, with the exception of Tangiers Shisha, Hookah, who make wooden hookahs in Poland, Cloud HMDs, and some Hookah John funnel bowls. Still, in the next 5 years, this progress was mostly limited to the domestic market. The developments that took place during that time, however, laid the foundation for the global takeover that followed later. The most important development was perhaps the fact that Darkside and Must Have, they fairly quickly took over the Russian market. So anyone who was trying to launch a new brand now had to face a serious question. Why would anyone buy me if we have two large brands with a lot of resources that offer what the market wants, what the users need, in terms of flavor, strength, and other parameters? Why would anyone choose something different? This situation gave rise to a healthy competition that played a key part in the overall growth of the industry. New brands, be it tobacco, hookahs, bowls, accessories, really had to go above and beyond to get the piece of the pie. This was usually achieved by a combination of two selling points. New brands try to achieve superior quality, or they try to offer something completely new to the market. On the quality side, it could mean using more advanced flavoring solutions, better tobacco blends, or improving heat resistance. On the side of innovation, it could be introducing new, absolutely banger flavors, new categories of flavors, or even entirely new presentation of Shisha as a product. Thus, by the early 2020s, a multitude of new brands edged their way into the picture, but were still focused on the domestic market, or at most the CIS market. Meanwhile, bigger Russian brands started really pushing for global success. For example, Darkside and Must Have are currently a premium option in almost any respectable lounge in the US. Alpha Hookah became a standard unit for lounges, events, tastings, even home users across the world. Bowls such as Cosmo Bowl and Oblako became the most popular choices for working with Russian tobacco. At the same time, Russian lounge franchises such as Hookah Place are opening spots in Dubai, Europe, and Asia. So by 2025-2026, it is clear that Russian Shisha became an industry standard globally. While Middle Eastern and American brands from the early 2000s were betting on tradition and slow pace in the industry, Russian brands took an aggressive and innovative approach. They employed top-notch scientists and engineers to work on their product lines, experienced flavorists to develop unique flavor profiles, and a host of talented marketologists, ambassadors, and community managers to get the word out there about their brands. This ultimately allowed them to achieve the industry golden standard status. So basically, there was no magic behind this Russian Shisha boom. It just so happened that the entrepreneurs in Russia decided to take the industry seriously, while in most other places it was considered either a niche do-it-yourself trade or a tradition with no need for innovation. More recently, however, it does seem that some brands internationally are learning to adjust to the new reality. For example, Alfakar has learned the lesson from Russian Shisha marketologists, and they are doing a very solid job with their new line of flavors. They carried out a proper release, there are tasting events happening every once in a while, and they make their presence known in the industry trade shows. They are trying to use the same marketing techniques laid out by Darkside in the late 2010s, which allowed them to take over the Russian market back in the days. Likewise, Fumari recently released a new blend of Virginia and Burley called 50/50 line. In the spirit of innovation, they are trying to embrace the industry trend towards dark leaf and enter new markets with it. Moreover, in certain areas, international brands are even taking the lead from the Russians. The new e-hookah trend, electric hookah, took off in the US and China, and there already seem to be signs of first success with brands such as XK and Enso. Apart from the e-hookahs, however, the market globally would probably average out to the state of the Russian market in the late 2010s. This actually creates a very interesting trend. If you want to predict where the global market is going to go in a couple of years, you just need to look at the Russian hookah market a couple of years back, and that would give you a good perspective. So let's use it to see what's kind of coming in the future to the global hookah industry. After making the name for Russian Shisha, Darkside and Must Have lost their positions somewhat in Russia. and are now focusing more on the international markets. In Russia, newer brands such as Sibero, Sarma, Hooligan, Blackburn, along with premium brands such as Bonshe, Kraken, Deus, Dogma, are becoming more popular among average smokers. And in a year or two, these brands are going to start getting the international recognition on par with Darkside and Mastiff. And I know these brands currently are well represented in top-of-the-line kind of lounges and hookah stores in the US and globally, but what I'm talking about is they're actually going to get more sales power behind them. Besides, while the international market is learning about and falling in love with the fresh, fruity berry, sweet and sour flavors, the Russian market has already gone through several stages in terms of customer taste. There was a period, for example, when dessert and gastronomical flavors were very popular alongside with alcohol flavors. So we're definitely going to see a bit of an uptick in customers' requests for more, I guess, unique, interesting flavors. After that, in Russia, the overall trend shifted from bright, easy flavors to more subtle and natural options. Flowers and herbal flavors mixed with more naturally tasting berries and fruits. More recently, no aroma surged in popularity. Brands started releasing non-aromatized tobacco blends so that smokers could enjoy the actual taste of the tobacco leaf unspoiled by any chemicals, any flavors. Lastly, the most recent development was the introduction of perfume flavors, a completely new way to understand flavors in smoking. So looking a little into the future, we'll definitely be seeing lounge customers asking for more naturally tasting, complex, and unusual mixes. Besides that, the cigar leaf has been really popular in Russia for a while now, but it's only beginning to take off in the United States. So I would predict we will be seeing more cigar leaf shisha globally really soon. Also, ready-made mixes that have been popular since the times of Starbucks are seeing a bit of a resurgence. Darkside's Shake and Experience lines are hitting the US market, and other brands such as Blackburn and Hooligan released their own mixed lines and can be expected to make their appearance globally anytime soon. To summarize this whole discourse, the hookah industry is very much alive and changing. It is obviously impossible to capture every important event, brand, or player in one video. So if I missed anything, please drop a comment to continue the discussion. Overall though, hookah, as we've seen, has a rich history, but things really started picking up the pace in the end of 20th and in the 21st century. After a surge of high aroma Virginia leaf, by 2020, the global market started transitioning to dark leaf. Russian brands set an industry standard. You're gonna ask how? The short answer is they just did it better. Yet, I really want to emphasize that although a lot of the developments did take place in Russia, I feel like in the next several years, the global industry will start catching up. Russia just showed what happens if you take hookah seriously. And once everyone realizes that, we, as the end users, are in for a good treat. On this note, allow me to peace out and see you in the next vlog.